Headlines. North Korea threatens to attack South Korea's presidential office along with the White House if Seoul and Washington go ahead with their joint military exercise. More than 20 people have been killed and some 270 injured when several underground gas explosions ripped through Taiwan's second-largest city. And the WHO and the West African nations hit hardest by deadly Ebola say they're pumping $100 million into a battle against the disease. And the U.S. disease control body is also promising increased aid. Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to the show. Thanks for tuning in. After this week's by-elections, Korea's National Assembly, with its semi-new look, is now focusing on a number of bills designed to boost the Korean economy. And still at the top of the agenda is a key piece of legislation designed to uncover the exact cause of the April ferry disaster. Kim Young-gil fills us in.
More than 7,000 bills await parliamentary review, but none are perhaps as urgent as the one that is aimed at uncovering the causes of April's ferry disaster. The rival parties continue to spar over the details of the so-called Seoul ferry bill, which proposes creating a panel of inquiry to look into the tragedy. But Missionary Party lawmakers remain opposed to giving the panel prosecutorial powers. Other bills on the table include one that would subject civil servants and their relatives to criminal penalties if they accept more than 1 million won, around $8,000, from a third party, regardless of whether it was intended as a bribe. The scope of the measures are under dispute by the parties who can't agree on whether they should extend to siblings, spouses, or even cousins of civil servants. And with President Park Geun-hye urging all-out efforts to boost the economy, lawmakers are under pressure to pass a stack of economic bills. They range from the introduction of tax schemes that encourage companies to pay higher wages, and easing mortgage rules that limit loans for home buyers, to support for companies that transition temporary employees into permanent positions. The ruling Missionary Party's victory in this week's by-election raised its number of seats to 158 in the 300-member National Assembly. That means the governing party can now push bills through the parliament unilaterally without the cooperation of the main opposition party. Kim Young-gil, ARIRANG News.
North Korea is nothing if not consistent. A propaganda group with ties to the regime has issued a statement calling on South Korea and the U.S. to put the brakes on their joint military exercise. It's threatening to attack South Korea's presidential office and the White House if they don't. Park Ji-won reports.
North Korea's National Peace Committee said the regime would target South Korea's presidential office of Cheongwade, the White House, and the Pentagon with their most advanced rockets and missiles if South Korea and the U.S. go ahead with 2 weeks of joint military exercises in mid-August. The Ulchi Freedom Guardian drills are held every year and are designed to improve joint defenses against North Korea. But this year's different in that it focuses more on a deterrence strategy aimed at North Korea's nuclear threats. North Korea said testing the deterrence strategy plan is just like a declaration of war against Pyongyang. The committee said inter-Korean relations were at risk of collapsing completely and that the Korean peninsula is in a volatile situation. South Korea's defense ministry shrugged off the North's threat on Friday and said the exercise would go on as planned, reiterating that they are completely defensive in nature. The ministry also called out North Korea for its recent series of missile launches and increasingly hostile rhetoric, saying they've gone too far. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
Now, against this backdrop, a group of defense experts is advising the U.S. government to work closely with China to prepare for a worst-case scenario in North Korea. Kim Min-ji reports.
American defense experts say the U.S. government needs to closely communicate with Chinese leaders in order to prepare for a state of emergency in North Korea. A report by the U.S. National Defense Panel led by former Defense Secretary William Perry and retired Army General John Abizad says the most probable emergency scenarios would be the breakout of a war or regime collapse. The independent panel assesses the Pentagon's quadrennial defense review. The report added there was an increased need to dispatch U.S. troops to South Korea amid heightened tensions on the peninsula. It added that the stationing of smart weapons was also urgent in order to ease nuclear tensions and reduce civilian deaths in case of war. Citing the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, the report said North Korea is concentrating on the development of nuclear weapons and missiles because it lacks conventional military strength, adding that plans are needed to secure the North's nuclear weapons in case they fall into the hands of terrorists. The panel also said North's precise guided missiles and poor cyber community makes it difficult for U.S. defense planners to come up with plans in how to deal with an emergency situation out of Pyongyang. The panel report added the defense review fails to fully address growing national security threats, including nuclear proliferation by North Korea and Iran, the insurgency in Iraq, and the crisis in Ukraine. The chairman of the House Committee on Armed Services, Howard McKeown, said the U.S. military is facing a high risk, adding that a strong military underwrites all other tools the U.S. has for global influence. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG News.
And staying with North Korea, Washington has once again called on Pyongyang to release Kenneth Bae, the American missionary detained in the north now for more than 18 months. The U.S. State Department has expressed concerns about his health and called for a special amnesty and an immediate release on humanitarian grounds. The statement comes after Mr. Bae told a pro-North Korean newspaper based in Japan this week that he felt abandoned by the U.S. government.
For the latest in news that impacts Korea and the world, join Kang Chae-ri for a lively half hour that covers politics, business, international news, and much more. Live at 8 every weeknight on ARIRANG TV.
Human Rights Council headquarters in Geneva on Thursday, finding ways to persuade. Korea has enjoyed export success in a number of industries ranging from smartphones and steel to petrochemicals. But Chinese companies are now flooding the market with their cheaper products, forcing Korean enterprises to branch out to other sectors. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
China is increasingly taking bigger bites out of Korea's pie. Chinese smartphone makers are starting to encroach on Samsung Electronics' territory. Although Samsung remained #1 in global market share in the first half of the year at 23%, China's Xiaomi was a close second at 21%. The Chinese smartphone makers are gaining ground as their skills catch up with their attractive pricing. It's a similar story for Korea's petrochemical and steel companies. The operating profits of Korea-based steelmaker POSCO in the second quarter stood at $547.6 million, down from $681 million on year. At the same time, the rate of steel imports used in the domestic market has sharply increased. The proportion of steel imports stood at 40% from January to May this year, up more than 11 percentage points compared to the same period last year. More than half of those imports came from China.
The business life cycle, when looking at the Korean steel industry, is in its maturing stages. It will be difficult to compete with competitors from China in terms of price competitiveness. Korean industries need to seek out new fields in order to survive in the global market.
An official from the Korea Trade Investment and Promotion Agency told the Seoul-based Joseon Daily that the country needs to expand the types of goods it exports and should shift more of its focus toward consumer goods such as health and beauty products and the service sector. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
Despite the threats out of China, Korea's trade balance stayed in the black for the 30th month in July. Exports rose 5.7% on year to $48 billion, while imports gained 5.8% to $46 billion. Compared to July last year, exports of wireless mobile devices saw the biggest increase at 25%, while exports of ships went the other direction, dropping 14%. The shipbuilding industry was hit due to an 80% drop in orders from China. The Trade Ministry says related ministry officials will meet soon to discuss the slump in exports to China, which is the largest importer of Korean goods. The amount of people using the Android operating system hit an all-time high during the second quarter of this year. This is according to market research firm Strategy Analytics that said global smartphone shipments reached 295 million units in the second quarter, up 27% on year. Of those, 85% were Android smartphones, jumping nearly 5 percentage points from a year earlier. The market share of Apple iOS fell to 12%. Microsoft dropped to 2.7%, while BlackBerry and others also lost ground. The Korean government has announced an extra 5 trillion won, or roughly about $4.8 billion in stimulus spending. That's on top of the $40 billion package the government announced last week. Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan says this extra funding came available because of the stronger Korean won, which decreased the foreign currency debt owed by public agencies. This will be channeled to building public rental housing and power plants, helping to pay off student loans and supporting small businesses. Korea's July consumer prices gained at the slowest rate in 3 months as the price of vegetables and livestock stayed relatively stable. July consumer price index rose 1.6% last month on year, slower than the 1.7% gain the month before. The agency attributes this low but stable price increase to a lack of severe weather conditions such as typhoons or heavy rainfall, which has led to some bumper harvest. Core inflation, which excludes things like oil and food prices, rose 2.2% on year last month. Finance Ministry officials expect the prices to remain stable for the time being. There's a service out there that's foreign to many Seoulites but is catching on like wildfire. The smartphone app-based car service Uber has been in Korea for about a year now, and the users have started to enjoy their smooth rides, although it does come at a steeper price. But Uber has recently run into some roadblocks. The Seoul city government says the service is illegal and is looking to block this application. Lee Ji-young tells us more.
Kim Il-min is a software engineer and startup business owner. He's also an avid user of the viral car service Uber, which landed in Seoul just about a year ago. With a simple tap on his smartphone app, Kim has a luxurious ride ready to take him across town. His personal pickups are usually reserved for special occasions when he wants an extra something for himself, and he says that's what makes the experience special.
The drivers are a lot friendlier, so it feels good as a passenger.
Uber is now found in more than 150 cities across the world, but the service is still relatively new in Seoul, and the premium black sedan service, Uber Black, is so far the only option available. But the Seoul city government strongly opposes Uber's service and just last week threatened to ban the app, calling it illegal. It says Uber is encroaching on the business of other taxi drivers in Seoul. So how much of a problem is it in Korea's mega capital? We asked taxi drivers whether they know about Uber, and the response was no, no, and no. Only 3 out of 20 drivers were aware of the application. And it's not so much about Uber snatching up their customers, it was more about the legality of their cars. It's an argument echoing Seoul City's stance on the car service. But Uber denies this, saying it uses car companies already licensed for business operation. And users say those cars have been providing excellent service in a city where at times it's impossible to get a cab, especially in downtown areas late at night. They say it's a comfortable, convenient option at your fingertips.
And that option, I believe, should be available for all citizens. And I don't think that necessarily takes the pie out of any industry, but we just create that option for that special need.
And while saying it will actively try to block the Uber service, Seoul says it will create its own app for cab drivers in the city.
The fact that there's demand for the service, even though it's more expensive, means there's a problem with existing taxi services.
Meanwhile, Uber says it wants more people to know about the service so they can hitch their rides, not on a curb, but on their phones. Lee Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
This week and the next are generally considered the peak summer vacation season here in Korea. Often it's when vacationers head off on a big trip overseas, but this year many are choosing to spend their break at one of Korea's prime holiday spots. Shin Se-min tells us more.
The peak summer vacation season is here. From late July and early August every year, more than half of Korea's population takes time away from their daily grind to go on vacation, especially now that school's out.
My 11-year-old daughter is free from school and academies these 2 weeks, which is why we're taking our family vacation now.
Many Koreans tend to go overseas for their holiday, but this year, with economy stagnant due to the nation's April ferry disaster, vacationers are opting to stay within the country. Among the numerous sites to visit, many are choosing to head to beaches or valleys to beat the heat. Popular destinations like the southeastern port city of Busan are overloaded with people enjoying the sun and surf. Filling almost every inch of the 1.7-kilometer stretch of sand, the nation's largest beach has already welcomed over 1.5 million people this past Sunday alone.
Spending my vacation with my friends in Busan couldn't have been better. We've planned many things during our stay.
As an office worker, it wasn't as easy to take days off for the vacation, but now that I'm here with my girlfriend from Japan, I plan to eat and show her as many attractions in Busan.
And with the week-long Busan Sea Festival kicking off this Friday, including concerts and bikini competitions, the city is sure to attract even more visitors.
It's crowded and can be expensive, but that hasn't stopped the flow of vacationers descending on Busan in the past and won't this year either. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News, Busan.
The World Health Organization says it's preparing to launch a $100 million campaign to tackle the worst Ebola outbreak in history. And Paul is joining us for more. Paul, the virus has claimed over 730 lives since it first broke out in West Africa earlier this year. How are they hoping this new plan will contain the disease?
Well, officials from the WHO say the funding will go towards an emergency response initiative with hundreds of medical personnel to be deployed to the hardest hit countries, that's Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. Health authorities worldwide are watching the unprecedented Ebola outbreak very closely over concerns that it's getting out of control and it could eventually spread across the globe. Our Connie Lee has more.
Health authorities in West Africa are struggling to contain a deadly Ebola outbreak.
To look over this fence right behind you now and look at the patients, and you know that their chances are very small, and it's horrible.
More than 700 people, including dozens of health workers, have died so far from this year's outbreak, and there are currently more than 1,300 others who are confirmed to have the virus. Sierra Leone, one of the hardest hit countries, is currently in a state of emergency, and health officials have begun to quarantine certain areas. The rapid spread of the virus is putting a strain on the nation.
Already we had a very, very inadequate health workforce, and we don't have enough specialists in country as far as medical doctors and even specialist nurses are concerned.
That concern has spread throughout the world. The World Health Organization said Thursday that it is launching a $100 million response plan to combat Ebola in West Africa.
The plan includes, identifies a whole range of medical personnel required to help support the response to the outbreak.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has advised Americans to avoid non-essential travel to Sierra Leone Guinea, and Liberia. And according to CNN and USA Today, the U.S. government plans to test an experimental Ebola vaccine as early as September. There is currently no cure or vaccine for Ebola, and the fatality rate of the current outbreak stands at about 60%. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
And turning now to Taiwan, where a series of underground explosions have killed at least 25 people and injured some 270 others. Paul, this is being called the deadliest gas explosion in Taiwan's history. How are the authorities there responding to this disaster?
Well, thousands of people have been evacuated in the wake of the devastation brought onto the country's second largest city of Kaohsiung. The southern city was hit with multiple blasts late Thursday night that sparked a massive inferno which toppled cars and literally tore apart roads. Rescue workers are still searching through the debris for survivors as fires continue to burn into the early morning hours. Our Connie Kim reports.
A series of underground gas explosions in Taiwan's second largest city have killed at least 24 people and injured around 270 more. Fire officials say it happened around midnight on Thursday local time in Kaohsiung and came after multiple reports of gas leaks. The exact cause of the explosions is still being investigated, but the director of Taiwan's disaster agency said propylene, which cannot be extinguished with water, was likely to blame. The country's premier said there were at least 5 powerful blasts in total. Witnesses reported huge fireballs soaring into the air, and the city's sewage system was also hit. Residents said it felt like the area had been hit by a powerful earthquake. Although the biggest fires had been extinguished as of Friday morning, residents of Kaohsiung were told to stay home as a precaution. Search and rescue operations are still in progress, but power was out Friday for 7,000 households in the area, which is complicating efforts. Kaohsiung is Taiwan's biggest port city with a total population of about 2.8 million people. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
And Paul, now to some very short-lived welcome news to the crisis in the Middle East. I would say Israel and the Palestinian militant group Hamas have agreed to an unconditional ceasefire, and this latest truce began just a few hours ago, and it already looks like it's showing signs of collapsing.
That's right, Charity. According to Gaza Health Ministry officials, 4 Palestinians were killed and more than a dozen others wounded by Israeli tank shells just 2 hours after the ceasefire went into effect on Friday morning. The Israeli military has blamed Hamas for throwing the first stone, defending that it was responding to fresh cross-border rocket fire. Set to last for 72 hours, the brief truce between the two sides will allow for much-needed humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip.
During this time, the forces on the ground will remain in place. We urge all parties to act with restraint until this humanitarian ceasefire begins and to fully abide by their commitments during the ceasefire. This ceasefire is critical to giving innocent civilians a much-needed reprieve from violence.
Top Israeli and Palestinian delegations are gathering in Cairo for talks on finding a longer-term solution to resolving the conflict, which has resulted in the deaths of more than 1,400 Palestinians and 64 on the Israeli side over the past 4 weeks.
And finally, on a lighter note, but not to be taken less seriously, a pair of gloves worn by boxing legend Muhammad Ali has been auctioned off for nearly $400,000. What's the story behind these golden gloves?
Well, these particular boxing gloves were used by the People's Champion during his legendary fight against Joe Frazier in 1971 in what became known as the fight of the century. The match at New York's Madison Square Garden was the first of 3 fights with Frazier during the 1970s, marking Ali's comeback as one of the greatest heavyweights in the sport's history. Ali went on to defeat Frazier in the final matchup, dubbed the Thrilla in Manila in 1975. An anonymous bidder was able to get his hands on the piece of boxing history during an auction held at the National Sports Convention Center in Cleveland on Thursday. Chetty?
All right, thank you so much for that update. Always good to have you with us, and we'll see you back here in just about 2 hours.
Happy Friday. I'm Michelle Park here with the latest weather forecast. Now, heat wave advisories and warnings continue across the nation, while heat wave alerts remain here in Seoul. Now, it's important that you take precautions and stay cool in this kind of weather conditions to avoid any heat stroke. Now, as we're moving into the evening hours, clouds are beginning to roll in, and rain clouds perhaps under the influence of Typhoon Nakari. Now, tomorrow we're expecting heavy amounts of rain reaching up to 300 millimeters in the southern regions, along with some drops in temperatures. Meanwhile, showers are in the forecast for Seoul tomorrow evening, with highs still hitting up to the 30s. Now, going over to our temperature readings for tomorrow. Seoul will top out at 26 in the morning and reach up to 33 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will peak both up to 28 degrees. Now moving over to other regions, Jeju Island tops over to 28 as well. Dokdo hits 29, while Mangkeungang tops to 27. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and back to you, Teddy.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And that will do it for this edition of ARIRANG News. Thanks for watching.